Alright, hello everyone, my name is István. I'll be your guide today through a fascinating philosophical puzzle titled The Paradox of the Stone. This is the puzzle in philosophy of religion, but also metaphysics, and it also has ties, of course, to the history of philosophy. Now, what is this about? We are dealing with philosophy of religion, so we are basically dealing with a philosophical conception of God. And in much of philosophy, the arguments concerning God's existence and attributes are rational arguments. That is, philosophers try to avoid relying on scripture, on mystical insights, on testimony from not wholly reliable sources, and other sources that sometimes religions accept or traditions, cultures accept. In philosophy, we want to accept only rational, logical argument. And this is why the God of philosophers is sometimes very different from the God or gods featuring in particular religions like Hinduism or Christianity or Judaism and others. Now, the conception of God that is of interest to us here is this. There's a perfect being. That's the idea of a God in much of rational philosophical thinking. And such a being would be all-knowing, omniscient, all-powerful, omnipotent, and perfectly good, omnibenevolent. Now, the interesting thing is, are these three properties logically compatible, and do they make even sense? So, here's one way to think about what omnipotence means. The power to do anything. Unlimited power. It should be the most perfect power or the largest possible power. Obviously, the question comes up, can an omnipotent being do anything? What exactly does it mean that something is the largest possible power? For example, you might ask yourself, can an omnipotent being change mathematical truths? It's a mathematical truth that 4 minus 2 equals 2. Could a perfect being change this? What would such a change imply for the structure of our universe, for logic? Would we humans be aware of such a change, and so on? Can God create a triangle that has internal angles adding up to more than 180 degrees? What would that mean for the concept of a triangle? Could that even be possible? Right, these kind of questions come up. So there are many ways in which we can question what exactly omnipotence means. But these questions just help us to trace the shape of the conception, to make it more precise, to make it more clear to us what it means to have the largest possible power. However, there are also some questions or some ideas which pose paradox, or at least some thinkers think that they do. And a paradox, of course, is not very good. A paradox means that there's an unresolvable dilemma. Whichever horn of the dilemma we choose, we get into trouble. Now, here is the question that leads into this paradox. Can God create a stone that he can't lift? If the answer is no, then God cannot create the stone. So God seems to lack a certain kind of power. If the answer is yes, God can create a stone that God cannot lift, then there's a stone that God cannot lift. So again, God's power does seem to be limited. Either way, it seems that there is something that God cannot do. Now, if God is a perfect being, then God is omnipotent, and if God is omnipotent, then he should not lack any powers. So it seems that God cannot be omnipotent. That's what the paradox of stone tries to show. Now, the way this argument tries to show this, the paradox tries to show this, is by pointing out that the concept of omnipotence is incoherent. Nothing can really be omnipotent. However, there are two proposed solutions to this dilemma. Let's have a look at them, and let's very briefly think about what they mean for both the paradox and omnipotence. The first solution is this: God can create any stone, and God can lift any stone. That is, there's no stone that God cannot lift, and no stone that God cannot create. Hence, there's no limitation on God's powers. God can create any size, weight, or shape of stone and lift it too. Right, so this solution relies on the idea that the paradox is stating something false regarding omnipotence. Namely, it assumes that God, or an omnipotent being, a perfect being, could lack some powers. Now, what the solution makes clear is that an omnipotent being, omnipotence means basically that an omnipotent being would not lack any powers. So the idea that there could be a stone which either by its size, weight, shape poses a limitation on the creative or the lifting powers of an omnipotent being is logically impossible. There is no such stone. Hence the paradox cannot get off the ground and pose any problems. The second solution would be that if we accept that there is an omnipotent being, then it makes no sense to talk of a stone that such a being cannot lift. A stone that an omnipotent being cannot lift is logically impossible. Hence, if God lacks the power to create such a stone, God does not lack a real power. Right, so this solution is basically very similar to the implications of the first solution. The first solution was that God just doesn't lack any powers. It can create any size of stone and lift them too. The second solution spells out the insight that's motivating the first solution, namely that it just doesn't make sense to imagine or try to imagine a stone that an omnipotent being would not be able to lift. Such a stone is logically impossible, hence the power to create such a stone is not a real power. It's an impossible power. But obviously an omnipotent being doesn't have to have impossible powers. That's logically cannot be required. They only need to have real possible powers, and if the omnipotent being can create any size of stone and lift it too, it has all the real possible powers that it should. Both of these solutions basically try to prevent the paradox from getting off the ground. That is, they question some of the assumptions that the paradox needs to have in place in order to pose the dilemma that leads into the unfavorable two horns. If the solutions work, then we cannot even pose the paradox. Very often that's the way to diffuse a paradox. What do you think about the paradox? What do you think about the solutions? Try and look it over, try and find your own way around this argument. It's a good training for your philosophical thinking and also for your reasoning skills. I hope you enjoyed it. If you would like to read about any of this, St. Thomas Aquinas writes about the powers of God in the Summa Theologiae, Part 1, Question 25, Article 3. It's a brilliant book, fantastic structure, fantastic writing. Michael Lacewing, who is a fantastic educator, wrote numerous excellent introduction books to philosophy. Any of his books that can be used for the AS or the A-levels philosophy exams, that are the philosophy exams in the UK, can be used very fruitfully to get a good grip on the basic ideas, basic questions in philosophy of religion. And two articles that discuss specifically the paradox of the stone. One is George Mavrodes' Some Puzzles Concerning Omnipotence, and Wade Savage's The Paradox of the Stone. You can find these also in a link under the video. Thank you for watching. Have a splendid day. Goodbye.